LA Times announcing massive layoffs today, cutting the jobs of at least 115 employees.
I think that what I just saw with the LA Times tells me that legacy journalism is about to go under.
Massive layoffs at the LA Times. More than 20% of the newsroom staff is getting a pink slip.
There's two things that are happening like at the same time. One is
it's the largest workforce reduction in the paper's 142-year history.
You're seeing a bunch of layoffs at major journalistic companies that are legacy journalism. And then you're seeing a lot of new school journalism successes.
As the paper announced at least 115 layoffs today.
The billionaire owner of the Times says the cuts are necessary because the paper is losing $30 to $40 million a year.
And one thing that I noticed during the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial was that there were people on YouTube that were giving deeper dives than any news organization that was supposedly covering the case. The exact same thing happened with Jonathan Majors.
Since they never addressed the issue of her attacking him, they never litigated that at all.
And did not allow the pictures of his injuries to be entered into evidence.
Ergo, we never litigated her assault.
There's several people who are been watching the trial, who've been analyzing the trial. Some of them are attorneys, some of them are not attorneys, some of them are in court, most of them were not in court, and it doesn't make any difference because what they're doing is they're doing a deep dive, they're reading the court transcripts, they're analyzing the case, analyzing daily testimony, and quite frankly, they're doing a more thorough job than any of the people who were covering it at the so-called major news organizations. Well, guess what? That can't sustain itself. I mean, if you're in a mainstream news organization covering a story and there's someone out there in the world that's covering it in a more detailed way than you are, that person is going to win. And particularly if it's so easy to access that person's commentary and information, which of course it is because of YouTube. You have people doing lives, analyzing all sorts of things, whether it's sports or a court trial or a movie. And their commentary, a lot of times, is quite good. You know, the real trick of it is that I think starting in about 2000, when the bloggers started to show up and really concentrate on very specific things that were out there in the news, that's when I think I first started to notice that a lot of these mainstream news organizations were starting to get very nervous. And unfortunately, what comes along with that nervousness is they start to decide that they are going to, in some way, shape, or form, put stuff out in the media that is half-baked. Because what's happening is those journalists sitting in those legacy newsrooms are watching these newer media people show up and put stuff on Twitter and put stuff on Facebook and put stuff on YouTube. And they're trying to compete with that in real time, which they can't. And one of the reasons they can't is that the standards for someone who's a, quote, citizen journalist is completely different than somebody who's supposed to actually go and check the information before publication. So now what's happening is the legacy journalists are starting not to check the information before publication. And so the two things, the so-called citizen journalist and the legacy journalist, are starting to become the same. And what I've seen several times is information get into the paper that was not checked, that was not vetted, that was in no way analyzed or investigated. And that information turned out to be false. And so at the point where we get to a place where legacy journalists are starting to throw stuff out there in the same way that any person walking down the street throws stuff out there on Twitter, those two things become the same. The legacy journalist outfit is going to go under. You're not going to make money that way. There's no way. I think it was last year, the Washington Post lost 500,000 subscribers, 500,000. The LA Times that just laid off 115 people was losing. Advertising has gone to Google and Facebook. And so local news is decimated. I'll tell you what, I think that legacy journalism is going to go under within like 10 years. I just think that a lot of people are spending time on other platforms such as YouTube to find out not just the same information, but in a lot of cases, better and more thorough information than what they could find by a so-called legacy journalistic source. That's happening all the time. And you would think that, one thing about business that you learn is that if you're not doing something that can't be duplicated by somebody else, you're going to be made obsolete at some point. It's as simple as that. And I'm just finding increasingly that these legacy journalistic outlets are getting so desperate for web traffic that they're doing certain things that the public sees right through, that I think are destructive to their business model, because particularly for journalists, this is supposed to be about protecting the truth and giving people the truth. And ultimately, that has not been the case, and certainly not over the last 5 or 6 years. I've seen several things get published and printed that were not true. It simply were not true. And it was a disaster for all parties involved. I think it hurts the reputation of legacy journalism. I think I'm seeing too many people who are on YouTube who are not only duplicating the quality of legacy journalism, but they're surpassing it. And they're surpassing it by a lot.
And I think the rise of citizen journalism on apps like TikTok, Instagram, and elsewhere has overwhelmingly been a positive thing. The journalism industry is overrun with elite, underqualified, rich, entitled Nepo babies, okay? And that part of it is terrible. But that's not most journalists. And the majority of journalists losing their jobs in situations like this are the working journalists that...
And that can't sustain itself. We're seeing a lot of news organizations laying people off because they can't figure out how to make money with their content. And there's no way that losing $20 and $30 million a year is sustainable. I know it's just the LA Times, but not really just the LA Times. The Washington Post just had a round of buyouts after threatening layoffs for so long. We'll see how everybody does this year with the election, but I'm telling you, we've been watching layoffs happen for years now. So the LA Times situation is really not new. It's just a big chunk of people, though. They've laid off a third of their workforce in less than a year. So that is really just incredible. Also, I just think the desperation for clicks and the desperation for traffic leads to a very mediocre journalistic product in the end, because everybody's rushing to beat somebody who writes something on Twitter and they don't check anything. And this whole obsession with things that get clickbait, whether it's Donald Trump or anything else, is highly problematic. There's a lot going on there, but I think all of it leads to a shift to other platforms and a shift in people's choices of where they get their information. And yeah, I do have in the back of my mind the fact that Club Shay Shay got 50 million views. Yeah, think about that, 50 million views. There's no news source in this world that gets anything close to that. Now, he's not a news source per se. He interviewed somebody and it blew up, but a lot of his interviews have blown up. And what it shows you is almost anybody who's got a real big name recognition and works at it and does a pretty good job at an interview can get a lot of platform, a lot more platform than legacy journalism. So this is an interesting moment that we're in. And I just think that the LA Times layoffs are a great example of a tipping point for American journalism. And we'll see what happens next. Good luck.